Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
They didn't notice when I skipped Thanksgiving once. Or when I changed my major 3 times without telling anyone. Hell, I could have tattooed my diploma across my forehead and Grandma would have still asked Rick about his golf handicap like he was some kind of local legend. You think I am exaggerating, but I am not. At every family gathering, Rick Monroe was the shining star, the prodigy, the man who once, 2 decades ago, made vice president of a mid-sized insurance company and never stopped reminding us about it. Meanwhile, I was Linda's daughter, the quiet one, the polite girl who helped clear the dishes and stayed out of the way, like furniture that occasionally brought a pie to dinner. I sat at the long oak table, half listening to the laughter and clinking of glasses, feeling more like a ghost than a graduate. Balloons floated lazily in the stale June air. Decorations Mom had picked out with real pride. Congratulations, Haley. But the energy in the room told a different story. It was the kind of half-assed enthusiasm reserved for second-place trophies and participation awards. Uncle Rick was already 2 beers in, loud enough to hear over the Fleetwood Mac playing from someone's Bluetooth speaker. His voice was like nails dragged across a dinner plate. Every once in a while, someone would remember me and shout, "Hey, Haley. Great job, kiddo," before returning to whatever story Rick was telling about the time he almost got headhunted by a major firm in New York, the details of which changed every year like a bad fairy tale. I smiled through my teeth and said thank you more times than I could count, each one chipping away a little more at my patience. As I watched the scene unfold, I couldn't help but wonder why families like mine built pedestals out of lies and desperation, then expected the rest of us to bow down and worship them. Rick had spent his entire life polishing the same 5 achievements until they glowed like fool's gold, while I had clawed my way through night classes, 2 part-time jobs, and more breakdowns than I cared to count, but sure. Let's toast Rick's one big deal back in 1990-something. The smell of roast beef and overcooked green beans hung heavy in the air, mixing with the cheap perfume of my Aunt Debbie, who was clapping along half-heartedly as Rick told another story about real business acumen. Tyler, my best friend since middle school, caught my eye from across the room and made a face like he was going to be sick. I almost laughed. Almost. I twisted the tassel on my cap between my fingers, feeling the fabric fray a little with each rotation. It was a small, stupid thing, but I needed something to keep my hands busy, something to keep me from walking out the door and never looking back. Every polite laugh and forced compliment felt like a fresh layer of concrete being poured around my feet, anchoring me to a life I had never really fit into. And then, like a wolf scenting blood, Rick stood up. He tapped his beer glass with a butter knife, the sound sharp and demanding, like a dinner bell for bad decisions. The room quieted immediately, everyone turning their chairs slightly to face him, the way villagers must have gathered around the town crier in the old days. I felt my stomach knot, a sixth sense telling me that whatever was about to come out of his mouth was going to be one of those things that didn't wash off easily, like grease or shame. Tyler gave me a subtle nod, like "You good," and I answered with a tiny, almost invisible shrug. What else was I going to do? Storm out? Cry? No. Not tonight. Tonight, I was wearing a smile like a suit of armor. Rick cleared his throat with the importance of a man about to deliver a presidential address, even though we were standing in a backyard with patchy grass and a crooked fence that leaned to the left like it had given up on life. All right, he started, waving his hands like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. Everybody, raise your glasses for a toast to our Haley. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and a few people dutifully lifted their plastic champagne flutes filled with whatever was cheapest at the corner liquor store. I lifted mine too, if only to keep up appearances. Rick continued, his voice oily smooth. We're all real proud of our Haley, aren't we? She worked real hard. Bless her heart. There it was, that southern fried dagger hidden behind fake sweetness. I braced myself. But let's be honest, he chuckled, taking a swig from his beer. We all know she only got that scholarship because of pity. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, each syllable slithering into every ear, nestling deep into places they could fester. I felt every head turn slightly toward me, a mixture of sympathy, amusement, and something worse, confirmation. Like they had always suspected, and now Rick had just given them permission to believe it. I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I had been ready for this. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, while scrubbing floors at 2 in the morning or rewriting essays until my eyes blurred. I stood up slowly, setting my plastic cup down with the delicate care of someone disarming a bomb. I could feel every heartbeat like a drum solo in my chest, but my face was calm, serene even. I made my way toward the microphone they had set up for family speeches, my graduation gown swishing softly with each step. Tyler's eyes widened slightly, as if to say, "Holy shit, she's actually doing it." Rick was still chuckling under his breath, already certain he had won whatever invisible game he was playing. He raised his beer again in mock salute, smirking like a man who had no idea he had just stepped onto a trapdoor. I reached the microphone, adjusted it slightly so it didn't squeal with feedback, and looked out over the sea of faces. Some were expectant, some were embarrassed, and a few, bless them, were already looking down at their phones, pretending not to see the wreck about to happen. I leaned in slightly, letting the silence stretch, just a heartbeat longer than comfortable. And then I smiled wider, sweeter, the kind of smile that promises nothing good. Rick, still standing, lifted his glass in another mock salute. "Funny," I said, my voice clear and steady, "because they just offered me a job you interviewed for last month." The crash of Rick's glass hitting the concrete was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. For a second after the glass shattered against the concrete, the whole backyard froze, like time itself had been sucker-punched right in the gut and needed a moment to figure out what the hell just happened. You could hear the whirring of the ceiling fans strung up under the sagging patio roof, could hear Aunt Debbie's loud chewing because she was always chewing something whether it was appropriate or not, and you could hear Rick's beer sloshing weakly against the inside of his broken cup, a sad little swan song for his pride. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply kept my hand on the microphone and smiled, real sweet and real wide, like a girl who had just unwrapped the best damn present under the tree. For a heartbeat longer, nobody spoke, and then a few muffled coughs and uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd like the world's saddest golf clap. Rick stood there with his hand half raised, not sure whether to pick up the broken pieces or just keep pretending nothing had happened. He chose, predictably, the most cowardly route. He laughed. A short, bark sound that died almost immediately in the heavy summer air. "You got jokes now, huh, kid?" he said, voice a little too loud, trying to claw back some dignity with bravado. "Good for you. Always good to have a sense of humor when reality hits." I could feel his embarrassment radiating off him like heat from black asphalt, but still, he pressed forward, because that is what people like Rick always do. They double down, even when they are bleeding all over the carpet. His smile was tight, his jaw clenching in a way he probably did not realize everyone could see, but still he took one unsteady step forward and grabbed another beer from the plastic tub by his feet, cracked it open with a sharp hiss, and lifted it high again, like some deranged priest at a drunk mass. "Let's all give a big, heartfelt cheer for Haley," Rick said, louder now, voice laced with that same sticky sweetness that always made my skin crawl. For years of college, a fancy scholarship, and a bright future ahead, because somewhere out there, somebody took pity on a sweet little nobody. There it was, plain as day, no sugar to coat it, no polite veneer to hide it behind. He said it with a grin, but the words came out sharp and mean, slicing through the cheap decorations and Mom's well-meaning balloon arch like razor blades through tissue paper. I could feel my face heat up, the kind of slow burn that crawls up your neck and makes your ears throb, but I kept my feet planted and my hands steady. I would not give him this satisfaction. I would not let him think for even one goddamn second that he could still define me with his bitter, aging insecurities. I mean, Rick continued, taking a swig and waving his free hand around like a man conducting an invisible orchestra of assholery. Let's not kid ourselves. Haley worked hard, sure, but you know how these things go nowadays. Scholarships are all about who you can make feel sorry for you. Hard work? Please. The world's full of hardworking people flipping burgers and mopping floors. There was a beat of laughter from somewhere near the dessert table, a dry, hesitant sound that cut off quickly when others refused to join in. Rick noticed, of course, and it only made him louder, desperate to keep the spotlight on himself, desperate to make anyone laugh so he wouldn't feel how empty the room had suddenly gone. It took me, like, 500 hours to finish my final project. Maybe even 600. Whatever. No good at math, but it felt like 1,000, I thought, recalling how many nights I had stayed up, pushing past exhaustion, pushing past doubt, trying to earn something nobody in my family would ever think I deserved. Ever had someone try to tear you down at your proudest moment? Tell me your story, because I bet I'm not the only one who knows how it feels to have a dream pissed on by someone too bitter to have any dreams left of their own. I let Rick ramble a few seconds longer, watched him drag his own dignity behind him like a shredded flag, watched as the family around him, aunts, cousins, even my grandma, began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at one another. The spell breaking at last. Tyler caught my eye again, raised his eyebrows in silent question. You gonna end this? And God, I wanted to. I wanted to so bad my hands itched. Rick was winding down, sputtering into something about kids today, and everyone gets a trophy. The same tired garbage people like him have been spewing since the day they realized the world was not handing them gold medals for simply existing. I could have let it go. I could have stayed in my seat, swallowed my pride like I had done 1,000 times before, and told myself that it was not worth it. But something deep inside me, something old and angry and damn tired, stood up instead. I set my glass down carefully on the table, brushing a loose thread from the sleeve of my gown, and pushed back my chair. The leg scraped against the concrete with a sound like a warning. Rick paused mid-sentence, blinking at me like he couldn't quite figure out why his target was moving toward the microphone instead of slinking away in shame. Step by step, I crossed the backyard, my gown catching the breeze, the cheap gold tassel bouncing against my shoulder with every determined stride. Each footfall felt like a drumbeat, building, building, building towards something inevitable. I reached the microphone and wrapped my fingers around it, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Adjusted it down to my height. Rick was tall in the way that bullies often are, big enough to loom but too soft to truly scare anyone who knew how to stand their ground, and waited. Waited for the hush that always comes before the storm. The backyard was deathly quiet now, the only sounds the distant hum of the highway and the occasional snap of a bug zapper claiming another casualty. Everyone was looking at me, Grandma, mouth slightly open in surprise, Mom, eyes wide with a mix of fear and pride, Aunt Debbie, who had finally stopped chewing long enough to realize something was happening. And Rick. Poor Rick, whose smirk was curdling into something closer to confusion, and then, just maybe, fear. I smiled. I smiled the way a fighter does when they know the next punch is going to land clean. Then I leaned in close to the microphone and said, in a voice as bright and sweet as the lemonade my mother used to make on hot summer days, funny, because they just offered me a job you interviewed for last month. There was a beat of silence, a glorious beat where you could almost hear Rick's brain short-circuiting. Then, somewhere near the back, Tyler laughed, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet like a whip crack. Rick's hand jerked, his new beer slipping from his fingers, the can hitting the ground with a sad little thud and spraying cheap beer across his polished loafers. I smiled wider, letting the satisfaction wash over me, and in that moment, standing there in my dollar store graduation gown under a sagging arch of balloons, I was more powerful than I had ever been before. There are moments in life so sharp, so crystal clear in your memory, that you swear you can still smell the air and feel the weight of the moment pressing into your skin long after it has passed, and standing there at that microphone, staring at Rick's frozen, twitching face, I knew this was going to be one of those rare, perfect memories that would carry me through every awkward Christmas dinner and every forced family reunion for the rest of my life. For one brief, glorious second, nobody moved, nobody breathed, and the only sound in the backyard was the soft hum of a mosquito buzzing too close to the patio light. I could feel the heaviness of every eye on me, the stunned silence so thick it was almost a living thing between us, hanging heavy in the air like smoke after a bonfire has burned out. 50 pairs of hands, 50 pairs of feet, 50 half-raised glasses caught in a moment of collective disbelief, like one of those cheesy freeze-frame scenes in a sitcom right before everything goes gloriously to hell. Rick's face twisted, first into confusion, then quickly into something uglier, something desperate, as he stumbled for words the way a drunk man stumbles for the last chair in a crowded room. His mouth opened and closed like a fish thrown up onto a dock, but no words came out, only a soft sputter that sounded more like a leaky faucet than the big, commanding voice he liked to believe he had. The moment stretched long enough for someone to cough awkwardly near the dessert table, the sound sharp and jarring against the quiet, and then Rick finally found his voice, dragging it out from somewhere deep in his chest where his pride used to live. "What the hell are you talking about?" he said, voice cracking halfway through the sentence, the bravado draining from him faster than the cheap beer dripping from his ruined shoes. I tilted my head slightly, the way you might when you're explaining something to a particularly dim puppy, and kept my voice calm and measured, low enough that everyone had to lean in just a little closer to hear me. "I'm talking about the fact," I said, smiling without showing my teeth, "that Wessler Financial offered me the project lead position last week. You know, the same role you interviewed for last month. The one they said you weren't the right fit for." There it was again, that beautiful, blessed silence, and for a second, I thought Rick might actually faint right there in front of everybody, collapse backward into the sticky summer grass like a sack of moldy potatoes. His knuckles went white around the crumpled beer can in his hand, his face flushing a deep, ugly red that started at his collar and worked its way up like a bad rash. Around us, the guests started shifting in their seats, whispers breaking out like the first drops of rain before a thunderstorm, cousins elbowing each other and aunts whispering behind manicured hands, eyes wide and glittering with the kind of savage, guilty glee that people always try to pretend they do not feel when watching someone get publicly destroyed. I let the silence linger, let it stretch out until it became unbearable, then shrugged one shoulder with exaggerated casualness, as if what I had just said was no more important than announcing that we were out of ketchup. "They told me," I added, voice just a touch louder now so it would carry to the back of the yard, "they were looking for someone with leadership potential. Someone who wasn't, how did they put it, coasting on past accomplishments." Rick dropped his glass. Not threw it, not slammed it down in anger, he simply dropped it, the way you might if your fingers suddenly forgot how to hold anything at all. It hit the patio stones with a sharp, crystalline crash, spraying shards in every direction, and everyone flinched like a gun had gone off. If there had been any lingering doubts about what I had said, they were gone now, scattered across the concrete with the wreckage of Rick's carefully polished image. Aunt Debbie gasped so loudly you would have thought someone had slapped her, and Grandma Eleanor clutched her purse tighter against her chest, looking from Rick to me as if seeing both of us clearly for the very first time. For a moment, Rick just stared at the broken glass, as if trying to will it back into one piece, like maybe if he could just put that together again, he could somehow patch up everything else that was falling apart around him. His hands opened and closed uselessly at his sides, and I almost felt bad for him, but the memory of every snide comment, every eye roll, every time he had used me as the punchline to one of his sad little jokes hardened my heart against any flicker of sympathy. I leaned into the microphone once more, delivering the final nail in the coffin with the same steady, almost bored tone I had used the entire time. "Guess they're not big on pity hires after all," I said, letting the words hang there like the last note of a funeral dirge. The crowd, sensing that something massive had just shifted under their feet, stayed frozen for a beat longer before the whispers began again in earnest, louder now, meaner, fueled by the sudden realization that Rick Monroe, the family's golden boy, the self-proclaimed business genius, had just been knocked off his throne by the very person he had spent years pretending was invisible. Rick stumbled backward a step, his foot catching on a loose stone near the edge of the patio, and for a second, I thought he might actually fall. He managed to stay upright, but just barely, and when he looked up at me, there was no anger in his eyes anymore, only a sick, hollow sort of dread. The kind that seeps in when you realize the story you have been telling yourself for years is finally unraveling in public. Without another word, without waiting for permission or forgiveness or whatever it was he thought he deserved, I turned away from the microphone and walked back toward my seat, the path parting before me like the Red Sea, guests shifting awkwardly to let me pass, their faces a mix of shock, admiration, and something else, something darker, something close to fear. Tyler was waiting for me at the table, his grin so wide it looked like it might split his face in half, and as I sat down, he leaned over and whispered, "Remind me never to piss you off." I did not reply. I did not need to. The look on Rick's face, the shattered, broken pride leaking out of him like blood from a gut wound, was answer enough. The air after the explosion of truth was thick, not just with the heavy summer humidity, but with a kind of collective discomfort, the kind you only feel when a deep, ugly truth has been dragged out into the sunlight, still kicking and screaming. People did not know where to look, and so they looked anywhere but at Rick, and certainly not at me, except for Tyler, who sat beside me like a proud co-conspirator, arms crossed and grin hidden poorly behind a sip from his drink. Somewhere deep inside, under the adrenaline and the surge of overdue satisfaction, I could feel the ground shifting under my feet, and I knew things were not going to go back to normal, not ever. At first, it was small things, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when Rick came within earshot, glances passed over half-empty wine glasses, the sudden realization among the family that maybe Rick was not the untouchable giant they had spent years building up in their minds. Aunt Debbie tried to smooth it over with a nervous laugh and a joke about kids being mouthy these days, but her voice lacked the usual shrill enthusiasm, and even she could not meet Rick's eyes for more than a second. Grandma Eleanor, who had always treated Rick like the second coming of Elvis Presley, sat stiff and upright in her chair, her fingers twisting the hem of her floral dress, her lips pressed so tightly together they had almost disappeared. She did not say anything at first, but every so often I would catch her looking at me, her blue eyes sharper than I remembered, as if she was seeing me for the first time. Truly seeing the girl who had built something real while everyone had been too busy watching Rick shine. Rick, for his part, did what men like him always do when confronted with undeniable failure. He blustered. He laughed too loudly, slapped the backs of cousins who clearly did not want to be touched, made big, sweeping declarations about how none of it mattered, how small-time corporate gigs were beneath him anyway. He even joked that he was just waiting for the right offer to roll in, the kind of empty bravado that sounds hollow even when you are drunk enough to believe it yourself. But it was there, plain for anyone to see, in the way his shoulders hunched slightly inward, in the way he kept checking his phone like he was waiting for a call that would never come, in the way his smile cracked just a little bit more every time someone looked at him with something that wasn't admiration. Grandma Eleanor finally broke the growing, awkward murmur when she stood up slowly from her chair, her knees popping loudly enough for half the backyard to hear, and said, "Maybe we all expected too much of some people." She said it to no one in particular, but the words hung there like smoke from a burned-out fire, and everyone knew exactly who she meant. Rick froze mid-sentence, the laugh dying in his throat, and for a long, agonizing moment, he looked like a man about to scream or cry or both. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt like the winner of some great invisible war that had been raging for years without me knowing the rules. But all I felt was a strange, hollow ache, a loneliness that was somehow deeper now that the lie had been exposed. It was like pulling out a rotted tooth only to realize that the ache wasn't just in the tooth, but in the bone underneath, the whole structure compromised and crumbling. As the party began to sputter out, guests finding flimsy excuses to leave early, I drifted toward the edge of the backyard, needing a minute to breathe, to think. The string lights swayed gently in the breeze, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass, and I found myself staring up at the sky, searching for a star that wasn't obscured by the heavy suburban glow. It was there, in the half-dark near the old garage, that I finally understood something that should have been obvious all along. Rick's hatred for me, his endless need to put me in my place, had not been born today. It had been festering for years, maybe even decades, long before I was old enough to spell scholarship or even understand what a job interview was. Rick had not just seen me as a threat, he had seen me as a ghost of someone he hated even more than himself. My father. My late father, David Monroe, Rick's little brother, who had been smarter, kinder, and far more successful without ever needing to brag about it at every goddamn barbecue. My father had been the one people remembered fondly, the one who had built things that lasted, the one Grandma Eleanor still talked about when she thought no one was listening, her voice soft and sad and proud all at once. Rick had spent his whole life standing in David's shadow, and when David died too young, it should have been Rick's moment to finally stand alone. But then there was me. Haley, the inconvenient, stubborn reminder that David Monroe had left behind someone who could still outshine him without even trying. I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me before I saw him, the uneven, heavy tread of a man who has had one too many beers and even more regrets. I turned slowly, already knowing who it was, already bracing for the ugliness that was surely coming. Rick stood just a few feet away, illuminated by the harsh light of the garage security lamp, his face twisted into something almost unrecognizable, a raw, ugly sneer that barely hid the bitterness underneath. "You think you're better than me now, huh?" He slurred, voice low and thick with anger. "You think one little job offer makes you king of the goddamn world?" I said nothing. I had said all I needed to say back at the microphone. This was not my fight anymore. He took a stumbling step closer, and for a split second, I saw the flicker of something desperate in his eyes, something so broken and pathetic that it almost made me pity him. Almost. "You don't know shit," Rick said, jabbing a finger at me like he was trying to poke a hole through the space between us. "You think David was some kind of hero? You think he didn't have help? You think you're some self-made genius?" He spat the words like they were poison, like they had been rotting inside him for years, eating him alive from the inside out. "You're just like him," Rick hissed, voice trembling with rage. "You'll screw it up, too. Just wait. Just fucking wait." The words should have hurt. Maybe once they would have. But now they just sounded tired, worn out from years of resentment and wasted opportunities. Rick was not a villain. He was just a man who had lost more battles with himself than he could ever admit. I stepped back into the deeper shadow by the garage door, putting just enough distance between us that even if he lost what little control he had left, he would have to work hard to reach me. I stared at him for a long moment, really stared, taking in the sag of his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hand, the desperate sheen in his bloodshot eyes. "Go home, Rick," I said finally, voice flat and tired and utterly without fear. "Go home before you embarrass yourself even more." For a second, he looked like he might argue, like he might reach for some final cruel insult to hurl my way, but in the end, all he did was turn, staggering back toward the dying party, leaving me alone in the dark with nothing but the buzzing of the streetlights and the heavy, aching truth between us. For a few minutes after Rick stumbled back toward the party, I stood there near the garage, staring up at the darkening sky, letting the heavy night air settle against my skin like a second, sweat-dampened layer of clothing. The string lights above the patio flickered once, twice, struggling to stay alive against the gathering dark and for some reason that little stutter of light felt fitting, like even the house itself was tired of pretending everything was fine. I could hear the noise from the backyard still rolling weakly across the lawn, half-hearted laughter, low murmured conversations, the clink of glasses desperate to fill the awful silence that had fallen after Rick's very public implosion. I did not want to go back. I did not want to weave through the brittle smiles and brittle people pretending to still be having a good time because, after all, what else could they do now? But I also knew I could not stay hiding by the garage all night, so I straightened my cap, smoothed the front of my cheap polyester gown, and started making my way slowly back toward the patio, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to punch its way out and run for the hills. When I rounded the corner, Rick was waiting for me again, standing at the edge of the party's dying light, beer still clutched in one hand like a lifeline, his shoulders hunched and sagging, his face a blotchy, miserable mess that no amount of swagger could save anymore. He looked older than I had ever seen him, like the years had finally caught up to him all at once and dragged him down into the mud he had been pretending not to wade through for years. "Hey," he said, voice hoarse, cracking on that one small word as if even speaking now was costing him something vital he could not afford to lose. I did not stop, but I slowed, just enough for him to think he had my attention, just enough for him to spill whatever last sad truth he had been choking on all night. He stumbled forward, the beer sloshing dangerously over the rim of the can, his eyes wild and red-rimmed, searching my face for something I knew he would never find. "You think you're better than me," Rick slurred, not a question, but a dull, resigned accusation, the kind that comes from a man who has finally realized the fight is over and he is lying face down in the dirt. I opened my mouth, thought about answering, thought about telling him that it was never about being better, that all I had ever wanted was a chance to be seen as more than a background character in the great drama of his bloated ego. But in the end, I said nothing, because it would not matter, because men like Rick only hear what they want to hear and drown out the rest with the clatter of their own failures. Rick took another staggering step closer, close enough now that I could smell the sharp, sour tang of the beer and sweat clinging to him like a second skin, and then he laughed, a low, bitter sound that seemed to crumple his whole body inward as he let it out. "You know what's funny?" he said, wiping a hand across his mouth like he was trying to scrape the words off his face before they could escape. "I peaked at 30. 30 goddamn years old. Big job, big promises, big future. Thought I had it all figured out." He leaned against the rusted side of the garage for support, the metal creaking under his weight, his head hanging low like a broken puppet on a string. "But nobody tells you," he continued, voice softer now, almost thoughtful, "nobody tells you how fast it all dries up. One wrong move, one bad boss, one missed opportunity, and poof, you're done. You spend the next 20 years bullshitting yourself and everyone around you, pretending you're still climbing when really you're just sinking slower than everyone else." The words hit harder than I expected, not because I felt bad for him, I didn't, not really, but because I could see the horrible, naked truth in them. Could see how a man could rot from the inside out and never even realize he was already dead to the world he was trying so desperately to impress. Rick pushed off the wall, swaying slightly, and looked at me with something like pleading, like he wanted me to tell him it wasn't true, that it wasn't his fault, that the world had wronged him, and he was the real victim here. "You're lucky," he said, voice thick and wet with whatever miserable thing was choking him. "You're young. You still believe the world's gonna give you what you deserve. You still think hard work matters." I did not correct him. I did not tell him that I knew better than anyone that the world owes you nothing, that you earn every inch you claw for, and, even then, sometimes it still slips through your fingers. I just let him keep talking because somehow I knew he needed this, needed to spill it out into the night air, to finally hear himself say the words he had been too proud to admit for far too long. "You're gonna find out," Rick said, almost whispering now. "You're gonna wake up one day, and nobody's gonna care how smart you are. Nobody's gonna care how hard you worked. They're just gonna forget you ever mattered." He dropped the beer can then, let it roll into the shadows like a dead thing, and wiped his mouth again, swaying where he stood, looking smaller and sadder than I had ever thought possible. I could have said something cruel then, could have twisted the knife, could have listed every moment he had humiliated me, belittled me, shoved me to the sidelines so he could take the center stage for himself. I could have told him he deserved every ounce of misery he was choking on now. But I didn't. Instead, I just gave him one long, level look, the kind you give a man standing at the edge of a cliff he built with his own 2 hands, and then I turned and walked away without another word. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. As I reached my car and slipped inside, the engine humming to life beneath my hands, I glanced once at the house through the open window. Through the living room window, I saw Rick standing alone, framed by the flickering yellow glow of the party's dying lights, a forgotten man in a crumpled shirt, surrounded by empty chairs and half-eaten plates and people who were already finding ways to rewrite the night in their heads. Funny how the ones who laugh the loudest at your dreams end up haunted by their own.